Okay, so hiya, welcome. We're going to do minority influence today for our lesson. So today is going to be a little bit different from all the other lessons that we've done. So we've looked at obedience, we've looked at conformity, and now we're going to have a look at actually what changes. Because conformity and obedience seem to be following the crowd, but obviously that isn't always the case. That things do change, things adapt, things grow. The majority opinion is not always the majority opinion, so how does that progress? How does that change? And usually it's through this thing called minority influence. That is what we're going to have a little look at. So hopefully by the end of this you're going to be able to describe and evaluate why minority influence is necessary. A case study, Moscovici's study into minority influence and the different explanations for minority influence. So this is an activity I like to do when we've got a class environment. So this is just to have a little go at planning an unpopular opinion. It involves standing up and giving this opinion to the rest of the class. So obviously if you're listening to this then you won't be able to do that, but maybe you want to have a little giggle at some of the topics. I haven't had anyone successfully argue that every school should have a naturist day, but I have heard some very convincing arguments about that every boy should own at least 3 Barbie dolls. So there you go, something to mull over. But let's have a little look at the lesson. So if the majority always wins, if they're always going to be the big opinion, how do we explain things like the suffragette movement? How do we explain things like Christianity, Nazism, and the Green Movement? These were all once unpopular opinions, but they did grow to be the majority opinion, sometimes for the betterment of society, sometimes for the detriment. So the case study we're going to look at today is Moscovici et al. His aim was to see whether a consistent minority of participants could influence a majority to give an incorrect answer in a colour perception test. There seems to be a lot of colour perception or visual perception sort of things that go on in psychology, so just more of the same in that respect. It was done in 1969, so it's again quite an old study. So what was the procedure? They had 172 participants. They made sure there was no colour blindness because that's going to be quite important in a colour perception test. There were 6 participants at a time and they were asked to estimate the colour of 36 slides. So all of the slides were actually blue, but they were of differing brightnesses, and then 2 of the 6 participants were actually accomplices, confederates, stooges. They were in on it with the experimenter. So there were 3 groups that took part in this experiment. There was a control group, and a control group is basically the baseline. It gives us something to compare against when we're doing our experimental conditions, because it's all very well saying, oh look, this experimental condition showed this percentage of things, but actually you need something to compare against. So we had a control group where nobody was calling the slides wrong colours and just wanted to see what people would say. So the experimental groups were consistent and inconsistent. So consistent, 2 accomplices called the slides green on all of the trials. They were actually all blue. And then an inconsistent condition where 2 accomplices called the slides green 24 times and blue 12 times. So 2/3 of the time they were calling them green and 1/3 they were calling them blue, but it wasn't consistent. What happened? Well, the findings in the consistent condition yielded, so they relented, they conformed, and they called the slides green 8.4% of the time. That doesn't sound like a lot until you kind of compare it against this one. So participants yielded and only called the slides green in 1.3% of the trials. Again, it doesn't sound like a lot, does it, considering we've been working with really big percentages in other studies like 37, 65, 8.4 doesn't sound like that much. But considering that you have 8.4% who are consistent, that's much bigger than 1.3, and that is even bigger than the control. So in the control, they've only misidentified the slides 0.25% of the time. So that's just human error. So that is a massive, massive difference, and there's obviously something happening between the consistent and inconsistent conditions for people to change their minds and call the slides green. And then this percentage here, 32% of the participants in the consistent condition reported this green slide at least once. But really these are the figures that we're after, that 8.4, that 1.3 and that 0.25. So what did he conclude from this? He concluded that actually minority can influence the majority in certain circumstances. Consistency seems to be the most important factor. Remember, we have that 8.4 compared to that 1.3. That is a massive difference. And he also found that there were other factors involved, so there's flexibility, where actually showing that you agree or disagree and that you can compromise on an argument is quite important. Showing commitment to your argument, so sticking to it is also very important. Things like relevance, so is it time for a change, or is that idea still quite new itself, so therefore people aren't willing to change. Culture takes 7 years to change, by the way. Informational social influence, which we're already familiar with, so we want to be correct, and internalisation, where we change both our public and our private opinion. And this, in minority influence, is called conversion. So therefore, we're converting from the majority opinion to the minority. So some evaluation for this, well, it was laboratory studies, so therefore it isn't necessarily ecologically valid. It was all female participants, which is quite unusual, but again, not generalisable to the population. It lacks population validity. All American participants, again, it lacks generalisation. In terms of population validity to the rest of the world, and there were obviously ethics involved. There was a bit of deception. Did they actually give informed consent? Because there was deception, did they have the right to withdraw, and did they have a good debrief? Well, you'd assume that they did have a good debrief, but we shouldn't deceive participants in that respect. So it's kind of this cost-benefit ratio that we're trying to weigh up. Not as bad as maybe electrocuting people, but still something to consider. So what I would like you to do is have a little go at these questions. So what is meant by control group and why is it used in this study? So I have already previously talked about control groups. So why was it used in this study? To present the results in a bar chart, and you have to pick the right results in that respect. So 3 marks to make sure that your graph is labelled, that it has axes and that the data is plotted beautifully, and state the conclusions which can be drawn from this study as well, so what sort of things can be concluded. So now would be a good time to pause the recording because I'm going to talk about the results in just a wee seconds. Okay. So what is meant by the control group and why is it used in this study? Well, control groups are really important because they give us a baseline to which we can compare things. So it's all very well that we've got colour perception tests and we're looking at consistent and we're looking at inconsistent. But if we didn't have anything to compare against, we wouldn't know that it's such a huge difference. We'd just be looking at that 1.3 and that 8.4 and going, oh, that's nice. That 0.25 makes us realise that actually there is something happening there, and it is to do with that consistent and inconsistent minority. That is why it's so important. The results you want to present in a bar chart, you should have ignored that 32%. The 8.4, the 1.3 and the 0.25 are the only ones you should really have on that chart. 8.4 and the 1.3 are acceptable, but having that control group on there would also make a difference. Bar chart, the whole point of doing a graph is to look at instantly see where the differences lie. So bar chart is most appropriate in this respect, and make sure it's titled, make sure it's got the axes labelled and stuff, because otherwise you will drop marks and get really easy marks to drop, so please don't do that. And the conclusions that can be drawn from this study, well, mainly that a consistent minority makes a difference. This showed the biggest change in opinions from the majority to the minority opinion, but inconsistent can still have an effect. Not as strong, but it can still have an effect because you have that 1.3. So, we've had a look at a key study. Let's try and put this back into real life situations. So just to reiterate, minority influence, it refers to a situation where one person or a small group of people influence the beliefs and behaviours of other people. It's different from conformity because conformity is about the majority influencing you. It is a perceived majority, okay? So they're not outwardly saying this, they just are, that you feel that pressure, you want to conform because it's actually such a strong feeling. But minority is different, and we're going to see this in just a wee second. Minority is actually most likely to lead to internalisation as well, because it takes such a lot of arguing and such to actually change someone's opinion. Obviously this is highlighted in the case study that we've just looked at, Moscovici, with green slide, blue slide, and these are some of the key things that came from that study. So consistency we've already discussed. So what makes it so important? Because consistency over time increases the amount of interest from other people. It helps people rethink their own views. If you remain consistent in your argument, maybe people think, why are they showing that? Why are they sticking to this opinion? So it makes people pay attention, it makes people rethink their own views, which is very important to change people's opinions. Other factors, commitment. So commitment in this case is showing obviously commitment to your cause, like sticking to your argument, but in some cases there might be some quite extreme acts. So in terms of some really extreme activities that draw even more attention to their views. So it puts some risk to the minority, and it obviously, if people are willing to hurt themselves or put themselves at risk, then this shows how committed they are to the cause. It makes people pay even more attention, and this is called the augmentation principle. So that is also quite important to help people change their minds. One of the examples I like to use is the Lush Sea Shepherd campaign. So if you Google Lush Sea Shepherd campaign, it should give you an image of a lady suspended by hooks in a shop window in Lush on Oxford Street. This was a number of years ago now, but this was an act of commitment. So the next one, which is really, really important to the minority influence, is flexibility. So this was argued by Nemeth, and it argues that consistently repeating the same arguments again and again can be seen as rigid, unbending, and a bit too inflexible. So even though flexibility kind of sounds almost counterintuitive to everything else, so consistency, commitment, stick to your views, etc., etc., you need to show some compromise. So because if you don't show flexibility, then actually it's really off-putting to the majority, and therefore the minority need to adapt their point of view. They need to show valid arguments, and there needs to be this compromise between consistency and flexibility, and these three are the most important things in changing a majority opinion, to changing people's opinions to the minority position. If you have all three of these things, then it makes people think about the topic over time and again, and it increases the number of people switching from the majority position to the minority, and therefore it will end up becoming the majority position in that respect. So it is quite important to have the snowball effect. So in terms of how people view the majority influence versus the minority influence, Moscovici argued that there was this thing called conversion theory. So therefore, having a difference in opinion creates conflict, and people don't like that. People don't like feeling conflicted. People don't like having difference of opinion, and people want to reduce that. However, people view majority influence differently to minority influences. So it is quite interesting to see the comparison, because with a majority influence, people compare themselves to the majority. They kind of want to be like the majority. They change their public behaviour to match the majority. They don't consider the corrections of the argument. They don't consider how correct it is. They just follow along because it's the majority opinion. Their private beliefs might stay the same, and there might just be this compliance with the majority position. Whereas a minority influence, if you have a minority view, your argument is automatically considered for its validity. How correct is that argument? If it's improvement, the minority influence is accepted, private beliefs are changed. This is the conversion effect, a conversion theory, a conversion effect. And therefore, people might fear being seen as part of a deviant minority, so therefore the public behaviour remains unchanged, but it can show internalisation of minority influence. And an example I like to give at this point is the fact that veganism, vegetarianism are minority opinions. So personally myself, I've been a vegetarian since I was 13 years old, but the amount of people who question me when I tell them this is just insane. So it's becoming less frequent now, but especially when I first became a vegetarian, the amount of people are like, well, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to do that? And because it's this minority influence, it's unusual. People question it, question the validity, they question why you're doing it. But I have shown consistency and commitment to it, and actually members of my family have become vegetarian as a result. Not through me overtly saying you need to become veggie, you need to become veggie, but just that because I have stuck to my beliefs and I've been vegetarian for so long, they've just converted naturally. They've considered my argument, and actually, yes, they've shown internalisation and they have changed, they have converted. So that's the best example I can give you in that respect. So when is this internalisation likely to occur? Well, there's a part of the theory called social identity theory, and this argues that when internalisation happens, it's because we've divided ourselves into different groups. There's an in-group, which is us, and an out-group, which is them. So minorities are often out-groups, and opinions get dismissed by the in-group. It makes change very difficult because it draws attention to the differences, and differences make people uncomfortable, and people don't like that. So in order for a minority out-group to be viewed as less threatening, it needs to draw attention to the similarities between groups. So for example, extremist fractions in Islam draw attention to a mutual out-group, the West, rather than the differences between Islam, and that makes people kind of connect and stay together, and it allows the out-group to be viewed as part of the in-group, and therefore they can exert influence on the majority. And another theory for you, so Hogg and Barkan, they identify factors that make a minority more influential. So if they've invested heavily in their argument, if they show strong similarities with the majority group, so therefore if someone was trying to convince you about their argument and they were similar to you in age or class, or anything else that makes you similar, you're probably more likely to pay attention to them. And if they're consistent but flexible in their beliefs, they need to adapt to what is relevant to society. So again, that consistency, that flexibility, they are really important. So what would I like you to take from this lesson? Well, here's some tasks for you to have a look at. A couple of questions there for you. The first one is mainly to practice getting you to write studies succinctly and cohesively. So outline Moscovici's study into conformity for 4 marks. So therefore you need to write aim, you need to write a little bit about the method, you need to write findings and what was the conclusion. And then we've got a little scenario question for you. So read the item and then answer the question that follows. A small group of environmentally aware sixth form students are campaigning for their school to become paper free for the next 6 months. Recently they had a meeting with a group of teachers who represent the teaching staff. The teachers told the students that the school would become paper free if the group of students could convince the rest of the student body if it was a good idea. So use your knowledge of conformity and minority influence to explain the factors that will help determine how successful the small group of students will be, and that is the marks. So you're going to have to talk about the main things that are important to minority influence, and then what sort of other factors are going to come into it. We have mentioned some terms in this lesson that are coming from our knowledge of conformity, so therefore how are they going to be able to demonstrate this in this answer. So have a go at these and hand them into your teacher, please. And another task as well is a flip learning task. So this is have a look at the film 12 Angry Men. It is available on OneNote in terms of the different aspects you have to talk about. It's quite a good film. It's about someone who is in a minority position and convincing a jury. So quite a good film to watch and take note and see the minority influence in action. There is a task associated to this, so find it on OneNote and have a little go at writing a piece about how Henry Fonda convinces the jury. So I hope that's been okay. Any questions, as ever, please do get in touch. Thank you very much.